Things don't just explode all at once. They build up gradually. They creep up on you when you're least aware, like a splinter that you barely notice at first. That's precisely how things unfolded between Sophie and me. For a long stretch, I genuinely believed we had the ideal marriage. Sure, it wasn't a bed of roses every single day, what marriage ever is. But 5 years in, I felt good about us. She was my wife, my partner, and I thought we were solidly in each other's corner. Together, we had crafted a good life. I work as a programmer. Not anything extravagant. Just enough to cover the bills, live in a decent place, and enjoy the occasional vacation. On the flip side, Sophie is incredibly sharp. A lawyer, she has this knack for winning arguments, even when she knows she's in the wrong, just through sheer determination. That intellectual prowess was one of the qualities that drew me to her in the first place. But as time wore on, that same sharpness began to feel like a double-edged sword. I particularly noticed it when she spoke to me as if I were a child, correcting my every word, making jokes at my expense in front of others. Sometimes it was playful, but often it cut deeper than I wanted to admit. Lately, those cuts had been becoming all too common. We shared a solid circle of friends, about 10 of us, and we often got together for trips, barbecues, and late-night parties. There was this comforting closeness that I never questioned. I never imagined I'd have to scrutinize any of them. There was Ben, the joker with a penchant for outrageous comments, and Nora, who could talk endlessly about work. James loved to debate politics over drinks, and then there was Ella, smart, funny, and undeniably beautiful. Back then, I didn't think much of her beyond friendship. My eyes were solely on Sophie, or so I believed. Now that I look back, it's all so clear, the little things that didn't seem significant at the time. I noticed Sophie's phone buzzing more frequently, her fingers flying over the screen. Way more than usual. Initially, I tried to dismiss it as paranoia. People text, right? It's just a normal part of life. But one name kept surfacing, Ben. I reassured myself they were just friends. Everyone liked Ben. He was hilarious. Yet, the way Sophie's face lit up when she talked about him felt different. Much more vibrant than when she spoke with me. I attempted to brush it off. But you know how your gut can sense something even when your brain tells you to calm down? That's exactly how it felt. I began to catch glimpses of their interactions. A shared glance here, a joke there. Things that seemed harmless at first glance. But once you start noticing, it's impossible to unsee. They were way too comfortable with each other. I'd overhear them laughing about adventures and sharing inside jokes that excluded me entirely. And Sophie, she looked at him with this spark in her eye, the very same one she used to reserve just for me when we first got together. The situation came to a head when we organized a weekend trip to celebrate our 5-year anniversary. Our entire friend group decided to book a resort together. It was meant to be a flawless getaway. Yet I could sense the tension simmering before we even set off. Sophie appeared distracted. Every time I attempted to discuss the trip or our anniversary, she'd flash a tight, forced smile, as if she were merely tolerating my presence. There were moments when I caught her texting right in the middle of our conversations, always with that same smug expression reserved for Ben's messages. Still, I convinced myself I was just imagining things. I reassured myself that I was being overly sensitive, that I was letting my insecurities take over. After all, it was our anniversary trip. She wouldn't do anything to ruin that. Would she? The first night at the resort started off on a high note. We had our friends gathered in our room for drinks, and the atmosphere was electric. Everyone was laughing, music was blasting, and glasses were clinking. Ben was in his element, weaving tales that had everyone in stitches. Sophie? She was right next to him. Not just nearby. She was practically glued to his side. Their knees brushed together, and she didn't make any move to pull away. At that moment, I had indulged a bit too much in the drinks to think straight. You know how it is when you start to drink. Your emotions can amplify, and even the smallest things seem monumental. So, when I caught sight of them so close, a knot twisted in my stomach. I tried to tell myself to chill out, that it was merely friendly banter. But damn, it was hard to ignore. The alcohol hit me harder than I anticipated, so I decided to call it a night early. I staggered off to the bedroom, leaving everyone else to continue the festivities. The last thing I remember before passing out was hearing Sophie's laughter. Her carefree, joyful laugh that used to fill me with pride. But this time, it wasn't directed at me. It was for him. Isn't it strange how, once you start doubting someone, even their most innocent actions can seem shady? Lying in bed, half asleep, I couldn't shake the image of Sophie with Ben from my mind. I kept telling myself I was being foolish, that I needed to trust my wife. But deep down, something felt off. You know that feeling when you sense a storm brewing, but there's nothing you can do to prevent it? That's exactly how it felt. Like the life I once believed I had was slipping through my fingers, and I was powerless to stop it. At that moment, I had no inkling of just how far things would spiral. I was completely unaware that this was merely the beginning. But looking back, that night at the resort, the laughter, the furtive glances, the incessant texting, that's when I should have clued in. That's when I should have confronted her. Perhaps if I had, things might have taken a different turn. Instead, I did what most people do. I ignored the signs. I convinced myself that everything was fine. And by the time I came to realize it wasn't, it was already too late. I jolted awake to the muffled sounds of voices and music seeping through the thin walls. My head pounded from the excess drinks. But something about the ruckus pulled me from my slumber. It wasn't just light chatter. It was louder and more chaotic. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly 3 a.m. The laughter, mixed with strange moaning, it all felt off. Initially, I thought the group was still partying, and I was just being paranoid again. But that gnawing feeling in my gut returned, the same instinct I'd been trying to ignore for weeks. I sat up, rubbed my eyes, and attempted to shake off the lingering drowsiness. The noise was clearly coming from the room next door, Ben's room. My stomach knotted tighter. I swung my legs over the bed, my heart racing, and made my way toward the door. I kept reassuring myself that I was being ridiculous, that this was nothing. Maybe all I needed was a glass of water. I could walk in, grab a drink, and laugh at how overly suspicious I was. But when I opened that door, everything changed in an instant. What I saw paralyzed me with disbelief. There was my wife, Sophie, the woman I had vowed my life to, entangled in an orgy with our so-called friends. The scene was surreal bodies intertwined, kissing, and lost in a haze of pleasure. There was Ben, his hands all over Sophie. I even caught sight of Ella in the mix, and James of all people, seemed to be reveling in it. I stood there, dumbfounded, unable to wrap my head around the horrific reality unfolding before my eyes. Felt like a punch to the gut, knocking the breath from my lungs. My hands shook, but somehow, I instinctively grabbed my phone. I needed proof, something tangible to confirm that this nightmare was real and not just a figment of my imagination. I hit record, capturing the horrifying tableau. The writhing bodies, the moans, the sight of Sophie fawning over Ben. It was repulsive. My wife, the one person I thought I could trust, was completely immersed in this disgrace. The cacophony overwhelmed me. Laughter, groans, music blaring from someone's phone. No one noticed me, frozen like a specter at the door. They were too lost in their depraved game, too far gone to care that I was witnessing their betrayal. Just as I was about to back away and escape, Sophie glanced up. Our eyes locked. The expression on her face is etched in my memory. Shock, guilt, and sheer panic all swirling together. She scrambled to her feet, shoving Ben aside, and rushed toward me, dragging me into the hallway. "Edward, wait. Please let me explain." Her voice was frantic, her hands gripping my arm as if that could somehow make it all better. I stared at her, struggling to process the frantic words tumbling from her lips. She kept insisting it wasn't what it appeared to be, that I didn't understand. But how could I interpret that in any other way? "It's not new. It's been part of our group for years," she stammered, her voice quaking. "Even before we got married. I wanted to tell you, but I was terrified you wouldn't understand. I thought you'd leave me." Tears filled her eyes, big, glistening droplets streaming down her cheeks. But all I felt was a white-hot rage, a searing anger spreading through my chest. She'd been deceiving me for years. Everything about us, our marriage, our shared life, was built on a foundation of lies. You mean to tell me this disgrace has been happening all along? And you never thought to tell me? My voice rose in disbelief and anger, but I couldn't contain it. I was scared, she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't want to lose you. Lose me? I laughed bitterly, the disbelief and fury boiling over. You lost me the moment you chose to lie about it. Can't you understand that, Sophie? There's no coming back from this. She continued to apologize, repeating that she loved me, insisting it didn't mean anything, that I was still the one she wanted. But how could I believe her? How could I trust a single word that came from her mouth after what I'd just witnessed? The tears, the apologies, they were meaningless. Nothing could erase what I had seen. I stood there, numb, as she pleaded for my understanding. But all I felt was the crushing weight of betrayal, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on my chest. When I looked at her one last time, I saw only a stranger. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I married, had vanished. In her place stood someone I didn't recognize, someone who had been deceiving me from the very beginning. Without uttering another word, I turned and walked back into our room. I left her standing there in the hallway, sobbing and scrambling to concoct an excuse for the unforgivable. But it didn't matter anymore. My world had already collapsed, and there was no way to piece it back together. I sank onto the edge of the bed, still gripping my phone. The video was saved, a cruel reminder of the moment everything shattered, sitting there in my gallery. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, fully realizing that nothing would ever be the same again. I lost track of time. Was it minutes? Hours? Time had lost all meaning. All I knew was that I couldn't sleep, couldn't think, couldn't breathe without feeling that crushing weight pressing down on me. Eventually, she returned to the room, her face swollen from crying. She settled beside me, but I couldn't bring myself to look at her. I just couldn't. Edward, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Please, I love you. I know I messed up, but we can get through this, can't we? Her words sliced through me like a knife. Get through this? How? How do you rebuild something that's been shattered into a million pieces? How do you move on from a betrayal so profound that it leaves scars that never heal? I had no answers for her at that moment, and honestly, I still didn't. All I could grasp was that the life I thought I knew, the marriage I believed was real, had vanished. There was no going back from this. The next morning hit me like a freight train. I woke up feeling like I'd been smashed in the head, and it wasn't just the hangover. My mind was racing, trying to process everything I'd witnessed the night before. Vivid images of Sophie intertwined with Ben and the others played on a relentless loop in my mind like some sick horror film I couldn't turn off. How had I been so blind? How could I not have seen it? I thought I knew her. I thought I understood us. Apparently, I didn't know a damn thing. The crushing weight of betrayal was suffocating. It felt like my brain was ablaze, ignited by 1,000 unanswerable questions. I lay in bed, staring blankly at the ceiling, grappling with how the woman I'd shared my life with could do something so vile. And worse, how could everyone else act as if it were no big deal? Were they genuinely that comfortable with it? Finally forcing myself out of bed and into the bathroom, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror. I looked utterly wrecked, bloodshot eyes, a pale complexion, hair standing on end. I splashed cold water on my face, hoping it would wake me from this nightmare. But the reality pierced through me like a dagger. This wasn't a dream. It was real, and it wasn't going away. After several minutes of standing there, frozen, I heard movement outside. The others were awake, and plans for breakfast were underway. The last thing I wanted was to sit down at a table with them, pretending that everything was fine. But avoiding them wasn't an option. I wasn't about to give Sophie or Ben the satisfaction of thinking they'd won. Not yet. As I stepped into the dining area, the tension hit me like a wall. Everyone acted like it was just another day, like nothing had happened at all. They chatted and laughed, completely oblivious to the most twisted scene I had ever witnessed only hours before. Then I spotted Sophie. She sat directly across from Ben, casually stirring her coffee, a small, knowing smile on her lips. Ben leaned in close, whispering something that made her laugh. That laugh, her laugh, grated on my nerves like nails scraping a chalkboard. It was the same sound I once cherished. Now, it belonged to him. My jaw clenched so tightly I thought my teeth might crack. Every shared glance, every joke exchanged between them felt like gasoline poured onto the raging fire inside me. Yet I forced myself to maintain composure, to sit through the charade, even though every muscle in my body screamed for me to flip the table and storm out. I attempted to engage a few of the others about what had occurred, hoping to elicit some honesty. But every time I brought it up, they dodged the conversation like seasoned pros. They laughed it off, made vague excuses, or pretended not to hear me at all. It felt like they were all united in a silent pact to ignore the elephant in the room. Nora was the only one who seemed to pick up on my unease. At one point, she pulled me aside, away from the group, and gave me a sympathetic look. "Are you okay, Edward?" she asked, her voice low enough to keep it between us. "What do you think?" I shot back, my frustration spilling over. Not at her, but at everything. She sighed and crossed her arms. "Look, I know this is a lot to handle, but we've all been close for years. This is just how it's always been." "Close?" I echoed, the word tasting bitter. "So close that my wife and her friends are sleeping together behind my back?" Nora didn't flinch. If anything, she looked weary, as if she had had this conversation countless times before. "I'm not saying it's right, Edward. I'm saying it's complicated. You just need to keep your eyes open. You don't want to find yourself on the losing side of this." "Losing side?" I hissed, my temper flaring. "This isn't some game, Nora." She met my gaze with one of those long, knowing stares that conveyed more than words ever could. I didn't understand what she meant then, but I would soon find out. Later, when I finally managed to corner Sophie, I confronted her with the question that had been gnawing at me all morning. "Why?" Her expression was almost indifferent, like she'd anticipated my inquiry. "It's not like I cheated on you, Edward. This is just part of us. Part of the group." "Part of the group?" I repeated, the phrase tasting toxic. "You think it's acceptable because it's part of the group? What kind of twisted reasoning is that?" She rolled her eyes, and that small gesture nearly sent me over the edge. "It's not a big deal. It's just sex. It doesn't change how I feel about you." "Not a big deal?" I could hardly contain the fury bubbling inside me. "You call what I saw last night not a big deal? You've lied to me, Sophie. For years." "I didn't lie," she replied with unsettling calm, as if we were merely discussing dinner plans. "I just didn't tell you." That was the moment it struck me, how fundamentally our relationship had shifted. Or perhaps it had never been what I thought it was. Maybe she'd always been this way, and I had simply been too blind to see it. "Is it still happening?" I asked, my voice cold and unyielding. She shrugged as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "Sometimes. Not all the time. It's just something we do." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "And you didn't think to ask if I was okay with that?" "I knew you wouldn't be," she said, devoid of any remorse. "That's why I didn't tell you." I stood there, staring at her, struggling to wrap my head around her sheer audacity. She didn't even offer a genuine apology. To her, this wasn't betrayal. It was just a facet of her life, our life, whether I liked it or not. In that moment, standing in front of her, a harsh realization hit me. The woman I believed I loved, the woman I thought I knew, was a mere illusion. The Sophie I married was nothing but a creation of my imagination. The real Sophie was a stranger, lurking in the shadows all these years. And just like that, it became crystal clear. There was no coming back from this. Not now. Not ever. I couldn't bear the anger any longer. It burned inside me, twisting my thoughts and consuming my mind with images of Sophie and Ben, their disgusting betrayal wrapped in the pretense of, "It's just sex." I needed to take action. Sitting around and pretending everything was okay wasn't working. Each time I laid eyes on Sophie, I could hear her dismissive voice echoing in my mind. "It doesn't change how I feel about you." Those words rang in my head like a dreadful song I couldn't escape. That's when Ella approached me. She must have noticed my misery during breakfast or perhaps saw how I avoided Sophie like she was poison. Either way, she pulled me aside, and part of me craved someone, anyone, to truly listen. We met up at the hotel bar later that evening, away from the others. I hadn't planned on unloading everything, but once I started, the floodgates opened. I told her about what I'd seen, about Sophie's betrayal, and how utterly lost I felt. The words tasted bitter, but Ella listened without judgment, her eyes full of empathy. "You don't deserve this," she said quietly when I finished. "You deserve better, Edward." Hearing those words hit me hard. I hadn't realized how desperate I was for validation, for someone to reassure me that I wasn't losing my mind, that Sophie's actions weren't normal or acceptable. We talked for hours. She shared insights about our friend group that I'd never known. How this wasn't the first time someone had been left in the dark. How some couples thrived on secrets while others fell apart. "You're not alone in this, you know?" she whispered, her hand gently resting on mine. "But that doesn't make it right." At some point, our conversation took a turn. I'm not sure how it happened, but suddenly we were no longer just talking. Ella leaned closer, her perfume enveloping us, her hand lingering on mine a moment too long. In that instant, something clicked. The anger and betrayal swirling inside me needed an outlet, and Ella was there, ready and willing. Before I knew it, our lips met. It wasn't soft or romantic. It was raw and desperate, fueled by everything I had bottled up since that night of horror. That night with Ella wasn't about love. It was about escape. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like the walls were closing in. I wasn't consumed by thoughts of Sophie or Ben or the web of deceit they had spun around me. It was just me and Ella, tangled together in a bed that didn't belong to Sophie, in a space where, for a few precious hours, nothing else mattered. When the sun began to creep through the curtains the next morning, I expected guilt to wash over me. But instead, I felt lighter, like I had reclaimed a piece of myself. Ella stirred beside me, brushing her hair out of her face, and gave me a sleepy smile. "What now?" she asked softly, as if she sensed this wasn't just a fling. That's when an idea struck me. If Sophie thought she could drag me into this mess without consequences, she was sorely mistaken. I wouldn't sit back and let her get away with it. I was going to expose her, show everyone the truth. Ella didn't try to dissuade me. If anything, she seemed invigorated by the plan. "They deserve it," she said, her voice filled with quiet fury. "You deserve to be heard." With Ella by my side, I felt invincible. This wasn't merely about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity, about proving to Sophie that I wasn't the fool she assumed I was. Later that afternoon, we returned to the resort. Most of the group was lounging by the pool, drinks in hand, pretending as if nothing had happened. Sophie was there, of course, sitting next to Ben with that same easy smile she used to wear just for me. My blood boiled at the sight, but I forced myself to stay calm. Ella shot me a reassuring nod, and I knew the time had come. I stepped forward, clearing my throat loud enough to command attention. "Hey, everyone," I called out, my voice steady despite the storm churning inside me. "I think it's time we address the elephant in the room." Sophie's smile faltered. Ben shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The others exchanged awkward glances, sensing the tension but unsure of what was about to unfold. "I know what you've all been doing," I continued, locking my gaze on Sophie. "And I think it's time everyone else knew too." Sophie shot to her feet, panic flashing across her face. "Edward, don't." But it was too late. I pulled out my phone and hit play, broadcasting the video for everyone to see. The screen lit up with images from the night's orgy, the sounds of moaning and laughter filling the air. The reaction was instantaneous. Gasps erupted, awkward shuffling ensued, and some turned away in embarrassment. Sophie stood frozen, her complexion draining of color as the truth unraveled before her. "You thought you could keep this from me?" I said, my voice low but laced with venom. "You thought I'd never find out. But here we are." Ben attempted to intervene, but I silenced him with a steely glare. "Don't even think about it," I warned. Sophie stammered, her hands trembling. It wasn't like that. I mean, it was, but it didn't mean anything." I laughed bitterly. "Didn't mean anything? You have a twisted way of showing that." She tried to spin the narrative, claiming I was overreacting. But the damage was already done. No one could unsee the video, and no amount of smooth talking from Sophie could alter what they had just witnessed. The group sat in stunned silence, their carefully curated world cracking under the weight of the truth. Ben looked like he wanted to vanish into the ground. Sophie, for the first time since I'd known her, looked genuinely terrified. "Was it worth it?" I asked, my voice icy and unwavering. "All the lies, the secrets, was it worth losing me?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. There was nothing she could say, no excuse, no apology capable of mending what she'd shattered. Ella stood by my side, her hand lightly resting on my arm, and in that moment, I felt a sense of conviction. Sophie had betrayed me in the worst possible way, but I wouldn't let her walk away unscathed. Not this time. I turned to leave, Ella following closely behind. As we distanced ourselves from the stunned silence of the group, I experienced a sensation I hadn't felt in weeks. Relief. The truth was out. The charade was over. For the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of freedom. Later that night, I found myself alone in the dim hotel room, my phone illuminating my face. Sophie had made one last desperate attempt to patch things up, standing there with that pathetic fake remorse dripping from her voice. "It was just a fleeting weakness," she whispered, as if that made it any more palatable. "It didn't mean anything, Edward. We can work through this." Work through what exactly? The years of deceit? The way she betrayed me and cast me aside as if I were insignificant? I was done. The rage simmered just beneath the surface, intensifying with every insincere word she uttered. I knew I needed to do something. Something that would ensure she felt the same humiliation she had thrust upon me. There was no reasoning with someone like her. No apology or excuse would ever suffice. She had stripped me of my trust and pride, and now it was my turn to take something from her. Her reputation. My hands trembled as I unlocked my phone. The video was still there, waiting. The audio captured everything. The laughter, the moans, the way they all reveled in their betrayal. I began editing, cutting out the extraneous parts, honing in on the most damning moments. The sound of Sophie's laughter with Ben, the unmistakable intimacy in their touch, the look in her eyes, like I was already a ghost, forgotten. Every frame of that video felt like a dagger twisting deeper into my chest. But instead of succumbing to the pain, I allowed it to fuel my resolve. I wasn't merely going to expose her to our friends. I wanted the entire world to see who Sophie truly was. When the edit was complete, I hesitated for just a moment. A small voice in the back of my mind warned me that I was crossing a line, that posting this video could unleash repercussions I couldn't control. But that voice had been silenced for too long. Sophie had chosen to betray me in the most humiliating way possible. Now it was my turn to make her face the consequences. With a deep breath, I hit upload. Within moments, the video spread like wildfire online. Comments started pouring in, some shocked, others gleefully mocking those in the footage. Sophie's name circulated rapidly. People who knew us, co-workers, acquaintances, even old friends, began sharing the video, tagging her and the rest of the group. The comments were brutal. Laughter, insults, crude jokes. Sophie had become the punchline in a never-ending joke. The fallout didn't stop with her. The repercussions reverberated through our entire circle of friends. Everyone in that video found themselves at the center of a storm they hadn't anticipated. Trust shattered, accusations flew, and the once close-knit group turned on each other. The same people who had shared laughs just the night before were now at each other's throats, scrambling to deflect blame and protect their own reputations. At first, I felt a surge of relief, perhaps even a glimmer of satisfaction. It was cathartic to know they couldn't simply sweep this under the rug, that the truth was now exposed for all to see. But that relief was fleeting. Almost instantly, the backlash began. The messages started small. Former friends, defensive and angry, accused me of crossing a line, of going too far. But then the threats began. Anonymous texts warning me to take the video down or face the consequences. People I once considered close began to turn against me, branding me the true villain and claiming I was the one who had destroyed everything. It didn't matter to them that I had been the one betrayed. In their eyes, I was the problem. I had unveiled their dirty little secret, and they weren't about to forgive me for it. Sophie, of course, was furious. She stormed into the room later that night, her face contorted in rage. "How could you do this to me?" she screamed, her voice hoarse from anger. "Do you even realize what you've done? My career, my life. You've ruined everything." I stared at her, emotionless. "Good," I replied coolly. She regarded me as though I were a monster, but I didn't care. She continued to shout, blaming me, insisting I had overreacted and was the one who had gone too far. "This isn't fair," she cried, as if fairness had ever factored into her actions. "Fair?" I scoffed. "You lied to me for years. You humiliated me, and now you want to talk about fairness." Her anger morphed into something darker, raw resentment. "You think this makes you the hero?" she spat. "You believe ruining me elevates you?" I didn't flinch. "I'm not the hero, but at least now, everyone knows the truth about you." Her expression twisted with rage, and for the first time, I saw her without her mask. The charming lawyer, the devoted wife. What remained was a bitter, selfish woman who couldn't stand the idea of losing her grip on control. After that, she resorted to everything, begging, threatening, trying to manipulate me into feeling guilty. But you can't manipulate someone who has nothing left to lose. I had lost everything, thanks to her. As she stormed out, slamming the door behind her, I understood that this was far from over. The threats, the backlash, the fallout, it was all coming, and it was coming fast. But for the first time in a long while, I felt a semblance of peace. There was no going back, no erasing what I had done. But that was precisely the point, wasn't it? I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to pretend that everything was fine, because it wasn't. And now, thanks to that video, everyone knew the truth. Let them talk. Let them judge. Honestly, I didn't care anymore. The only thing that mattered was my newfound freedom. It was just a matter of days before the aftermath escalated to a breaking point. The video did precisely what I intended. It tore through the web of lies Sophie had woven, laying bare the truth about her and Ben. But with that exposure came consequences I hadn't entirely foreseen. Sophie was floundering. The meticulously crafted image of her as a successful lawyer, devoted wife, and charismatic socialite vanished. Clients withdrew, colleagues exchanged whispers behind her back, and our so-called friends turned against her. The very people she believed she could manipulate were the first to abandon her. A few days after the video went viral, she came to see me. The moment I opened the door, I noticed something had changed. Her arrogance had vanished. The fake smiles were gone. Instead, there stood a woman on the edge of collapse. Her eyes were red-rimmed. Her hands trembled as she struggled to come to terms with the chaos she had created. "Edward," she began, her voice cracking. "We need to talk, please." I let her in, not out of affection, but rather curiosity. She sank onto the couch, her hands clasped tightly together as if they were the only thing holding her together. "We can fix this," she insisted, forcing a smile that failed to reach her eyes. "I know things spiraled out of control, but we've endured so much together. I love you, Edward. We can move past this." I stared at her, feeling an unsettling mix of pity and revulsion. How could she still believe that love had any relevance here? How could she think that after everything we could just pick up the pieces and carry on? "There's no we anymore, Sophie," I stated flatly. "You shattered us, and there's no way back." Her expression crumbled, and tears began to stream down her face. "It was a mistake," she murmured. "I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't think you'd understand." "You're right," I replied, my tone icy. "I don't understand. I never will." She begged, actually pleaded, for us to try again, to salvage what was left of our marriage. But there was nothing to salvage. Trust doesn't simply reappear after a betrayal like this. It was like attempting to patch a shipwreck with duct tape. "I can't live like this, Sophie," I finally said. "And I doubt you can either." Her face twisted in a blend of anger and sorrow, yet she didn't argue. Deep down, I think she recognized that it was truly over. By the time she walked out, any shred of sympathy I had felt for her had evaporated. I was done. Done with her lies, her manipulations, her endless games. It was time to move on. For both of us. The following day, I scheduled a meeting with a divorce attorney. Sitting in that sterile office, reviewing the details of our separation, felt like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just about splitting assets or signing documents. This was the conclusion of everything I thought my life would be. But as painful as it was, it also marked the first step toward liberation. The legal process dragged on, riddled with frustration and anxiety, yet I could feel the burden lifting gradually. With each form I signed and every meeting with my lawyer, I moved closer to shedding Sophie and the toxic environment she had ensnared me in. I realized I didn't just want to leave her. I yearned to escape everything tied to her. Throughout it all, Ella was my anchor. She became the unwavering presence I didn't know I needed. We spent countless hours discussing everything. My anger, my fears, my regrets. She listened without judgment, providing quiet support when it mattered most. Slowly, she helped me realize that this wasn't merely the end. It was the start of something new. What began as a means of escape transformed into something genuine. We didn't rush into anything. It developed organically, like two fragmented pieces finding a way to fit. Ella wasn't just a distraction from my pain. She became my lifeline, reminding me that life didn't conclude with betrayal. Months later, the divorce was finalized. I signed the last of the documents with an odd mixture of relief and sorrow. It was over. Sophie was officially out of my life, and I was free to begin anew. In the weeks that followed, I found myself reassessing everything. I quit the job that had kept me trapped in a monotonous routine for years. I began traveling. Just short trips at first, gradually exploring farther and farther, visiting places I had only dreamed about. I met new people, forged new friendships, and rediscovered parts of myself I had forgotten existed. Ella accompanied me on some of those journeys, and together we built something fresh, something untainted by lies or betrayal. She never tried to fill the void left by my past, nor did I expect her to. What we shared was distinct, and that was perfectly fine. It was authentic. One evening, sitting on a beach far removed from my former life, I reflected on everything that had transpired. The betrayal, the revenge, the divorce. It all felt like a distant memory. And for the first time in ages, I found a sense of peace. Betrayal transforms you. It breaks you down and forces you to confront the hidden aspects of yourself. But it also offers the opportunity to rebuild and start anew, armed with a clearer sense of who you are and what you truly want. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I realized that I wasn't harboring anger anymore. The bitterness, the fury, it had vanished. All that remained was an unexpected sense of gratitude. Not for what Sophie had done, but for the lessons it had imparted. She had attempted to break me, yet here I stood, stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever lay ahead. With that thought, I rose, brushing the sand from my hands. It was time to forge ahead, leaving the past where it belonged. I didn't know precisely what the future held, but for the first time in years I wasn't daunted by it. I was prepared for whatever life had in store. And this time, I was determined not to let anyone strip that away from me.